Montana Territory, August 1883. The sun was high and hot over the dry plains when Odessa Granger's hand trembled near the dotted line of a contract she never asked to sign. "Go on now," barked the man in the dusty sheriff's coat, slapping the table with the back of his hand. "You are holding up the county's business, Miss Granger." Odessa's jaw tightened. Sweat gathered at her temples beneath the brim of her hat, her dark brown hair tucked back as neat as she could keep it. She glanced down at the paper again. Her father's land, all of it, about to be sold off to pay debts she had never made and never agreed to. He had died 6 months ago, and the vultures had circled ever since. The lawyer cleared his throat and nudged the inkwell closer. "Your father owed this town more than he let on. It is best you let it go." "I said I would pay," Odessa said, her voice quiet but steady. "I just need, you are out of time. Then I will find more." "Miss Granger," the sheriff growled, "sign the damn papers." That was when the door slammed open. A gust of dry wind followed the man who stepped in, tall and broad-shouldered, dust clinging to the hem of his coat. His boots hit the floorboards hard as he crossed the room. His hat shadowed his eyes, but his voice was clear. "Her hand belongs in mine," he said, loud enough to stop every breath in the room. "Not on your damn papers." Odessa blinked. Tobias. Tobias Alderidge never forgot a face, especially not hers. Even after 11 years. He had not seen Odessa since they were kids, sneaking off to fish behind her father's barn. He had gone south with his uncle's cattle drive, and she had stayed behind. He had heard of her father's passing while drifting through Wyoming 2 months ago. And now, somehow, he was here, standing between her and the men trying to take everything from her. The sheriff narrowed his eyes. "And who the hell are you?" "The man who is going to marry her." Odessa's heart shot straight into her throat. "What?" Tobias turned to her, his voice dropping low and sure. "If they want a man to take the debt, then let it be me. If you will have me." Odessa stared at him, stunned. "You cannot just—" "I can," Tobias said. "And I will." The room was so quiet, the wind outside sounded like a howl. The sheriff slammed his palm on the desk. "This is not a church, Cowboy. You cannot just walk in here, and there is no law against a marriage solving a debt," Tobias said. "If she marries me, her land is protected. You know that." The lawyer, pale and uncomfortable, cleared his throat. "Technically, yes. With a husband, the debt transfers. If he takes responsibility." Odessa's eyes flicked between them, then to Tobias. "Why are you doing this?" He looked at her like he had not stopped missing her since the day he left. "Because I should have come home sooner." She did not say a word, just looked at him, standing there like he had always belonged beside her. The sheriff spat on the floor. "Fine, but I will expect payment within the month, or the land goes to auction." Tobias nodded. "We will find a way." They left the courthouse in silence, Odessa's skirts catching the wind at her boots. She did not speak until they were off the wooden sidewalk and behind the small post office, where no one could hear. "You are out of your mind," she said, her voice sharp. Tobias took off his hat and ran a hand through his thick brown hair. "Maybe. You think this is some kind of storybook?" "No. I think it is a second chance." Odessa crossed her arms. "You do not know what I have been through." "Then tell me." She stared at him hard, like she was trying to see if he was real. "My father drank himself to dust. I worked the ranch alone while men circled like wolves. I barely kept it from burning down when the stovepipe snapped in January. And now I am being forced to marry a man I have not seen since I was 12. "I did not say forced," Tobias said. "You can say no." Odessa opened her mouth, then closed it. Her eyes stung. "Why are you here, really?" He hesitated. "I came when I heard. I thought maybe I could help. Maybe I could fix something." "Well, you cannot fix me," she said. "I do not want to fix you," Tobias said. "I want to stand beside you." She looked away, her breath shaking. "I cannot marry you. Not like this." "Then do not," he said gently. "Let me just help. Let me stay." Odessa looked up at him. He looked older than she remembered, rougher, sun-darkened, with a scar at his jaw she did not know the story behind. But his eyes were steady, and they watched her like she mattered. "You really mean to help me keep the land?" "I mean to help you keep what is yours. That land is your home." Odessa swallowed hard. "I need a few days to think." "Take a week," he said. "I am not going anywhere." And he did not. He slept in the old bunkhouse behind the barn, helped mend the fence line, and rode the outer pasture each morning. Odessa watched him from the porch, her arms wrapped tight around herself as if she could keep her heart from jumping every time he smiled at her across the yard. On the fourth night, she brought him supper, fried potatoes and beans, and sat beside him while the sky turned gold. "You really would marry me?" she asked. "If it meant saving your ranch," he said, "and seeing you safe, yes." She looked down at her hands. "You were always kind." He shook his head. "I was a fool to leave." Odessa turned her eyes to him. "And if I said yes?" His voice was quiet. "Then I would take your hand and never let it go." She took a breath, and then she reached for him. The morning after Odessa reached for his hand, the air sharpened. A cold front slid down from the Judith Mountains, curling mist around the cottonwoods near the creek. Tobias was already out by the corral when she stepped onto the porch, the hem of her wool skirt damp from crossing the yard. He was working a green broke dun gelding, its eyes wide, hooves restless on the packed dirt. "He's got more spirit than sense," Tobias said without looking over. Odessa leaned against the post, arms folded. "Sounds familiar." He chuckled under his breath, then gentled the reins and stepped back. The gelding watched him with the tight wariness of an animal still learning to trust. "I'll take him north this afternoon," Tobias said. "There's a man near Big Sandy willing to trade 2 draft mares for a strong saddle horse." She hesitated. "You'd give up that animal for a trade?" "He's a fine horse," Tobias said. "But you need a team more than I need pride." Odessa bit the inside of her cheek. "You already gave up more than that." He turned then, dust on his sleeves, eyes steady. "I haven't given anything. Not unless you say yes." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked down to the fence, where a battered tin pail hung beneath the pump. She filled it halfway, then carried it to the row of hens scratching beneath the coop. The rhythm of feeding calmed her, let her think with something other than the tightness in her chest. "You haven't asked what happened after you left," she said finally, scattering grain. "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." "My mother took sick the winter after you rode off," she said. "She lingered 2 years. Papa sold most everything to pay doctors that never stayed longer than a week." Tobias rested his arms on the top rail. "I'm sorry. She was the only one who ever made him soft," Odessa said. After she passed, he turned meaner than the wind in February. She brushed her hands clean on her skirt and met his eyes. "I buried her behind the cottonwoods. You'd remember the spot." He didn't speak, but he gave a single nod, slow and sure. She came to stand beside him again, her fingers curling around the rail. "I always thought you'd write." "I did," he said. 3 letters. Gave them to a drover headed this way. I guess they never made it. I didn't get a word. I figured as much when I heard what had happened. That's why I came." Odessa was quiet for a long while. A breeze lifted the corner of her shawl. "Do you want a wedding?" she asked, not looking at him. "I want you," he said. "I'm not the girl you knew," she said. "And this place, it's no dream. The roof leaks, the well's gone shallow. There's a nest of weasels in the root cellar. I don't care if the walls fall in," Tobias said. "I just want to build something with you, even if we have to raise it plank by plank." She turned to him then, her eyes rimmed with something close to hope. "I haven't had joy in a long time." He didn't answer with words, just reached over and brushed a bit of straw from her sleeve, slow and careful, as if even that was a kind of vow. Later that evening, she found the old dress her mother had worn to church, a faded calico with tiny roses at the hem, and washed it by hand in the basin. She didn't tell Tobias, just laid it out to dry on the rail and watched it flutter in the wind like a flag. The next day, they rode to town in the wagon Tobias had repaired with salvaged oak and rawhide lashings. Odessa sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, a ribbon tying back her hair. She didn't say much, just watched the hills roll by, golden and wide, the sky above them endless and clean. The preacher agreed to marry them that afternoon. No guests, no supper set out. Just Tobias in a pressed shirt, and Odessa in her mother's dress, standing beneath the cottonwood behind the chapel while the light poured through the branches. When the preacher asked if she would take Tobias Alderidge as her husband, Odessa didn't hesitate. "I will." And when he asked Tobias if he would take her, Tobias didn't waver. Always. Afterward, they stepped out into the late sun, the town quieter than usual, as if it sensed something had shifted. Odessa didn't let go of his hand. Not when they passed the dry goods store. Not when the sheriff crossed the street and tipped his hat with a look of reluctant respect. Not even when they reached the wagon and the horse pawed once at the dust, restless to move on. She looked over at Tobias, her brow lifted. Still want to stand beside me? He leaned down and kissed her forehead, soft and warm. I already am. The first hard frost came early, silvering the pasture grass before dawn. Odessa woke to the sound of the wind pushing dry branches against the window panes. She moved quietly through the house, lighting the stove and feeding the fire until it caught. Tobias was already outside by the time she stepped onto the porch, pulling water from the well with slow, even effort. His breath came in pale clouds. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and crossed the yard, boots crunching over the frozen dirt. You're up early, she said. Tobias looked over, his hands red from the cold. The mare foaled last night, he said. Took longer than I expected. Is she all right? She's tired, but standing. The colt's strong. Odessa followed him to the lean to beside the barn. The mare stood quiet, steam rising from her back, the foal curled against her flank. Odessa crouched beside them and ran her hand along the colt's neck. Its coat was slick with damp, but its eyes were open, wide and alert. We should call him Flint, she murmured. Flint, huh? He looks like he's got fire in him. Tobias smiled, the kind that stayed in his eyes. Then Flint it is. They stood together in the hush of the barn, the smell of straw and afterbirth heavy in the air. Odessa didn't pull her hand away from the colt, not even when Tobias leaned down beside her. You were good with the birth, she said. You've done this before. Few times. In Texas, mostly. She turned slightly. You stayed there long? Not past spring. The man I worked for sold his stock and headed east. I drifted after that. Did you think of settling? Didn't feel right, he said. Not until now. Odessa let the silence settle before she spoke again. I didn't think I'd be a wife. I didn't think I'd be a husband, he said gently. But I like the way it feels. She looked at him then, truly looked, and saw the quiet steadiness in his expression. Not just kindness, conviction. He wasn't standing beside her because it was easy. He was here because he meant to stay. Later that morning, they worked side by side repairing the north fence. Odessa held each post steady while Tobias drove them in, sweat darkening his collar despite the chill. She didn't speak much, but her movements were sure, and her gaze didn't drift. When the last wire was strung, she straightened and wiped her hands on her apron. I've been thinking, she said. About the south field. What about it? If we clear the brush along the creek bank, we could plant oats come spring. It'll take work, but the soil's better there. Tobias nodded. We'll start after the last frost. She hesitated, then added, I've never shared that land with anyone. He rested his hand on the fence post. You're not sharing it. You're building it. That night, Odessa didn't sleep in the room her mother once used. She brought her quilt to the room Tobias had been given, and when he looked up from the oil lamp he was trimming, she said simply, It's too cold to sleep alone. He didn't reach for her, just stepped aside, letting her pass, and closed the door behind her. They lay side by side, fully clothed, the quilt tucked tight around them. The quiet between them wasn't the kind that left things unsaid. It was full of what didn't need saying. A few days later, Tobias came back from town with news. He sat at their kitchen table, a folded sheet of paper in his hand. Your father's debt's larger than we thought, he said. There's a lien against the west pasture. Another creditor filed before the sheriff did. Odessa set her coffee aside, a deep crease forming between her brows. What kind of lien? Lumber company out of Great Falls. Claims your father promised them timber rights in exchange for freight delivery. That pasture's got barely 10 trees standing. Doesn't matter. They want the land. She stood, crossed the room, and leaned her hands on the counter. Then we fight it. Tobias watched her carefully. We'll need proof he never made that agreement. I'll find it, she said. He kept receipts in a ledger under the floorboard in the old parlor. If there's anything, it'll be there. They searched together that evening, pulling up the warped board and lifting out the tin box beneath. Inside were years of records, some faded, others torn. Odessa flipped through with growing urgency. There, she said finally, tapping a yellowed sheet. He paid for freight, but there's no mention of timber. Tobias read it twice, then nodded. We'll take it to the circuit office. She slid the ledger back into its place and lowered the board. When she turned to Tobias, her expression was fierce, but not afraid. I won't lose this land. You won't, he said. Not while I'm breathing. She stepped close enough for her skirt to brush his boots. You meant that, didn't you? When you said you wanted to build something. I did. And not just out there. His voice dropped. No, not just there. Then she reached up and touched his jaw, rough with the start of a beard. You can kiss me now, Tobias. He did. Not like a man claiming anything, but like someone coming home. And that night, they didn't just share a bed. They shared a beginning. The wind that came down from the high woods that week was lean and dry, carrying the smell of far-off snow. Odessa stood on the ladder, hammer in hand, driving a new shingle into place at the edge of the roof. Below her, Tobias steadied the ladder with one hand and held a tin of nails in the other. You're favoring your left shoulder again, he said without looking up. I've got it. You tore something when you lifted that feed sack last week. I saw you wince. She drove the nail in anyway. It'll heal. Tobias stepped back and squinted up at her. You can let me take a turn. You already mended the porch, fixed the barn door, and rode out to the boundary line before dawn. You're not the only one with hands. He smiled, more in his eyes than his mouth. You always did hate being told to rest. I hate being treated like I'll shatter. I know you won't. She paused, the hammer resting against her thigh. That's why I let you stay. He didn't reply, just offered another nail, and let her climb down when the last shingle was in place. Her boots hit the dirt with a solid thud, and she wiped her brow with the corner of her sleeve. Inside, the house smelled of river sage and lye soap. Odessa had boiled the linens that morning, and they hung now on the line stretching from the porch to the shed, snapping in the wind. Tobias knelt near the stove, coaxing a fire from the damp kindling. She watched him from the doorway, the way his shoulders moved beneath the cotton of his shirt, how his fingers worked without hurry or waste. I got a wire from the circuit office, he said as the flames caught. Judge'll be in Fort Benton next week. Is that where we're going? He stood, dusting his hands. It's where the hearing will be. We'll need to show the ledger, and I'll testify. The land's in your name, but the debt's mine now. Odessa crossed the room, her steps slow. I never wanted you tangled in this. I'd rather be tangled with you than free anywhere else. She reached for the tin box on the shelf, the one they'd stowed the ledger in. Her fingers paused on the lid. There's something else in here. I didn't show you before. He waited, arms folded as she opened the box and withdrew a folded sheet of thick paper, its edges softened by time. He wrote this before he died, she said. My father. Left it in the ledger. Tobias took it carefully, eyes scanning the page. He named you sole heir? Says he regrets what he couldn't give you. I don't know if I believe a word of it. Even so, it's something. Might help with the claim. She looked down at her hands. Sometimes I wonder what kind of man he was before the drink. People change, Tobias said quietly. Not always for the better. But we don't have to carry the worst of them. Odessa folded the letter and put it back. That night, as the fire burned low and the wind pressed against the shutters, she lay beside Tobias in the quiet. Her hand found his beneath the quilt. I used to dream of leaving this place, she said. Why didn't you? I was afraid I'd vanish. That no one would even know I'd been here. He turned toward her. I would have known. She looked at him then, the firelight catching in her eyes. You really believe we can win this? I believe in you, he said. The rest'll follow. The next morning, they set out before dawn, the wagon packed with provisions and the ledger wrapped in oilcloth. Odessa wore her father's old coat, too big in the shoulders, but warm. Tobias drove the team steady and quiet, the reins loose in his hands. They stopped only once, near the river fork, where a patch of wild plums still clung to the bare branches. Odessa picked one and bit into it, the sweetness cutting through the morning cold. She handed the second to Tobias without a word. They reached Fort Benton by evening, the town lit by lanterns and the smell of wood smoke thick in the air. Tobias led the horses to the livery while Odessa secured a room above the mercantile. The innkeeper, a heavy-set woman with a slow drawl, raised an eyebrow at their shared name on the register, but said nothing. Upstairs, the room was plain whitewashed walls, a single iron bedstead, and a pitcher of clean water. Odessa set the ledger on the table and sat by the window, watching snow begin to fall in fine, light flakes. Tobias came in moments later, his coat dusted white. Horses are settled. We'll be ready for the hearing come morning. She nodded, then looked at him from beneath the edge of her shawl. I don't know what I'll do if they take it. He crossed the room and knelt before her. Then we'll start somewhere new. I don't want somewhere new. Then we'll fight harder. She reached for his face, her thumb brushing the edge of his cheekbone, where a faint scar curved down toward his jaw. You've got a way of making me believe things I didn't think I could. He kissed her then, slow and sure, and the snow kept falling against the window as they held to each other like they had already won. The courthouse in Fort Benton carried the chill of stone and old paper. The wood floor creaked beneath Odessa's boots as she stepped inside beside Tobias. Her coat hung heavy on her shoulders, still faintly damp from the snow. They made their way to the hearing room, where the judge, a lean man with a trimmed beard and deep-set eyes, sat at a plain desk, spectacles balanced low on his nose. The representative from the Great Falls Lumber Company sat stiff-backed to one side, a rolled map case and folded ledger stacked in front of him. He didn't glance up when Odessa and Tobias entered, but his mouth twitched, like he'd already decided how the day would go. The judge motioned them forward without ceremony. You're the Granger party? Yes, sir, Odessa said. Odessa Alderidge, formerly Granger. Tobias stepped beside her. Tobias Alderidge. I've taken on the debt as her husband. The judge nodded once. Let's see what you've brought. Odessa handed over the folded document with her father's signature and the freight receipts. Tobias passed him the family ledger. The judge studied them silently, his fingers tracing the inked lines. Minutes passed, marked only by the ticking of a wall clock and the scratch of the judge's pen against the paper. The lumber company man finally spoke. Mr. Granger offered us timber rights in exchange for 3 deliveries in the spring of '81. We fulfilled the contract. The land was promised. Do you have that agreement in writing? The judge asked without lifting his head. There was no formal paper, the man said tightly. But he told our agent, and we honored our part. Odessa kept her voice steady. My father was proud, but he drank. He made promises when he shouldn't have. He also wrote everything down when he was sober, and there's nothing in that ledger about timber. The judge turned a page, adjusted his spectacles, and read silently for another long pause. Then he looked up, expression unreadable. Without written confirmation of the timber rights, and with the receipts showing paid freight, I see no enforceable claim. The lien is void. The land remains with Mrs. Alderidge. The lumberman opened his mouth, then shut it again. He gathered his papers without another word and left the room. Odessa's knees went loose beneath her, and Tobias caught her elbow before she could sway. Is that it? She whispered. The judge nodded. You're free to go. Outside, the wind had softened, the snow tapering to a fine mist. They walked slowly back to the boarding room, neither speaking. At the door, Odessa turned, her face pale but calm. I thought I'd feel triumphant, she said. But now it's quiet in my chest, like something heavy's been taken away. Tobias brushed a curl of wind-blown hair from her cheek. That's what peace feels like. She stepped into his arms without hesitation. I want to go home. We will. In the morning. That night, they stayed up late, sitting on the quilted bedspread with a candle burning low between them. Tobias held her hand, thumb tracing the back of her knuckles. I don't need much, Odessa said, but I want to keep that ranch working. I want to build something that can't be taken. Then we pour it into the land, piece by piece. She looked at him long, quiet. And what about us? He leaned in, his breath warm against her skin. We've already started. She kissed him then, soft and sure, and nothing in her moved with doubt. They returned to the ranch 2 days later, the sun breaking through the clouds as they crossed the ridge. Flint trotted along the pasture fence, legs long and awkward still, and the draft mares nickered from the paddock as they passed. Tobias pulled the wagon around back, and Odessa stood for a while in the yard, just breathing. The house was still patched and weathered, but it was hers. Theirs. In the weeks that followed, they cleared the south field, hauling brush and turning soil. Tobias built a second hen house, and Odessa traded eggs and spun wool at the trading post to buy seed. They repaired the root cellar, patched the floor in the back room, and strung wire through the east fence line. One evening in March, Tobias came in with a splinter in his palm and found Odessa bent over a square of muslin at the kitchen table. What are you working on? He asked, shaking the snow from his coat. She held it up, a stitched square of cloth, the outline of a tree rising from the center, roots curling wide beneath it. A quilt for the first winter we won't be fighting to survive. He kissed her forehead, then went to the stove to warm his hands. That spring, the oats pushed through the soil in green rows. Tobias plowed the far field for hay, and Odessa planted a row of sunflowers along the fence. Each evening, they sat on the porch with their boots off, her feet in his lap, his head tilted back to watch the sky turn violet over the hills. By midsummer, the house felt different, fuller, like it had taken a breath and held it. Tobias carved a cradle from pine in his spare time, hands working slow and careful, sanding each curve until it gleamed. Odessa added a second row of stitching to the quilt, petals blooming at the corner of each square. One warm night, as the crickets started to sing, she stepped out onto the porch where Tobias sat with a tin cup of water in his hand. "I'm late," she said, voice low. He looked up, and when he saw her eyes, he set the cup down. "How late?" "Almost 2 weeks." He stood and came to her, cupping her face. "Are you well?" "I think so. Just tired. Hungry." He touched her lips with his thumb, then kissed her once, full and steady. "Then we'll get ready." They planted more oats that fall, and Tobias added a loft to the barn. Odessa quilted through the growing dark of late October, her belly rounding beneath her apron. Flint had grown into his legs and followed her like a shadow when she walked the fence line. The baby came in early February, just after a soft snowfall. A daughter, red-cheeked and strong-lunged, and they named her Clara. They raised her in the house Odessa's mother once scrubbed clean, in the fields Tobias had sown by hand. She took her first steps on the plank floor Tobias had laid himself, and when she laughed, Odessa said she sounded like spring wine through cottonwood leaves. Years passed, and still they rose early, worked hard, and came home to each other. Tobias taught Clara to ride, and Odessa taught her to stitch and read. They added a second room to the house and planted a cherry tree near the porch. On warm evenings, they sat with their hands entwined, listening to the chickens settle and the breeze move through the tall grass. They spoke little because they didn't need to. Everything they'd fought for, everything they'd lost and found, lived quietly between them. And they were happy, not in a way that burned bright and fast, but in a way that lasted, forged in work, held in quiet hands, and rooted deep in love.